Wavewalker, Breaking Free is a great new book. It's called Gripping, Vivid and Pacey by the Times. A 7-year-old girl on a 70-foot yacht for 10 years, over 50,000 miles of sailing. Age 7, Suzanne Heywood set sail with her parents and brother on what's supposed to be a 3-year journey around the world. So far, so kind of different. However, it turned into a decade-long way of life through storms, shipwrecks, reefs and isolation with little form of schooling. She's put this down in a book called Wavewalker, Breaking Free. It's been described as a classic memoir of childhood. Delighted to be joining me from somewhere on dry land, I would imagine. Suzanne Heywood. Suzanne, good morning to you.
Hi, good morning. Delighted to be here.
A pleasure. Whereabouts are you on the planet? You look like you're fairly, and this will be the last thing I say that is naval-based, landlocked today. So where are you?
Very boringly, I'm in London today, so quite a long way from the sea.
Right, fair enough. So tell me a little bit about then what led you. I mean, you didn't have much of a decision in this. Did your parents? Did they show much of a nautical bent? Did they suddenly say, hey kids, we're going to go around the world? Was this completely off the cuff from them?
It really was. I mean, my father had sailed a little bit. He'd crossed the channel a few times and had a couple of small boats. But he suddenly came up with this idea that we were going to sail around the world in the wake of Captain Cook. I should say my maiden name is Cook.
Aha.
So there was a kind of tenuous connection, although I don't think we're related. So he wanted to sail around the world to recreate Captain Cook's third voyage around the world. Now, the problem with that is Captain Cook on his third voyage sailed the wrong way around the world. There is a right way and a wrong way, by the way, because the winds blow in one direction. Yeah. So we were going to sail the wrong way around the world across some of the world's most dangerous oceans. So he basically just announced this over breakfast one morning when I was 7 years old.
Okay, so up to that point, it'd been a pretty normal childhood. Imagine school friends, all the usual bits of riding bikes around this sort of place, swinging on trees. So what was your and you had a brother as well. What was the reaction to that one then?
Well, my reaction was pretty mixed. I mean, I love my dad to bits. I thought he was a brilliant sailor. You can imagine kind of hero worship, small girl. On the other hand, I was going to leave behind, as you say, all my friends, my beloved dog, Rusty, a kind of water spaniel. I know, kind of that was terrible. My doll's house, I just got a doll's house for Christmas. And all of that I was going to leave behind to go on this kind of mad adventure with my father. Right.
And your mother, she obviously was up for this as well, presumably.
Well, my mother is no great sailor. Right. My mother always got seasick, so she was not very enthusiastic. On the other hand, my parents were very close. So if my father was going to go, she was going to go. And if she was going to go, then my younger brother and I were going to go with them as well. Really, there was no choice.
Right. They were very close. You're going on a yacht. Now, you get even closer if you're in a yacht, because we're not talking ocean liner here, are we? So what are we looking at, Suzanne, in terms of the actual craft itself?
Well, she was a 69-foot sailing boat made of wood. Now, that sounds pretty big, but she was actually very narrow. She was only about 12, 14 foot wide. So down below, what you have is a small main cabin that has a table that sits kind of 4 or 5 people, a galley kitchen, and then you've got some cabins with bunks in them. But the bunks are so kind of crammed in, you can't actually sit up in them. Right. So for the whole of my childhood, what I had was a bunk and a drawer. In a cabin, usually sharing with somebody else.
Yes, interesting to put it mildly. So, you set sail from where? From in the UK, and where was the first port of call?
So we set sail from Plymouth, and the first major port of call was down in South America. So we went all the way down the Atlantic, right. North Atlantic, South Atlantic, to Rio in South America. And that's when actually it began to become apparent to me, even as a little girl, that it was a bit odd because we weren't really following Cook, because Cook actually didn't go there on his first voyage. But I think my dad decided it'd be fun to go to South America. And then we went from South America all the way across the southern Atlantic Ocean to South Africa.
The Great Southern Ocean. Not to be fooled with, not to be trifled lightly. Bigger craft have gone missing. The weather turns. There's a great book called A Voyage for Madmen, which talks about the single-handed race around the world, and the stuff that went on in the Southern Ocean. You're just touching the roaring 40s, etc., aren't you? So, a couple of things spring to mind. is how did you get on with your brother during these first couple of weeks of all sharing? Because it's one great thing is people, yes, I'm going to sail around the world. It's going to be wonderful. The children will get an education. They'll learn off the land. The flying fish will catch, the whole thing. The harsh reality can be you're uncomfortable, you're wet, you're cold, you're shivering, you're tripping over each other, and that's just the good bits.
Yeah, no, so my brother and I, to start with anyway, and this whole story evolves, as people will see if they get a chance to read the book. And in fact, the kind of narrative around the relationships between the family, which start to deteriorate as we go on, because this voyage goes on and on and on, is possibly the kind of most interesting thing. But to start with, this all feels like a bit of an adventure. So there's flying fish, there's whales, there's lots of storms. My brother and I kind of play together. We play a game where when the boat is in a terrible storm, you try to walk from one end of the boat to the other without touching the floor, because you can basically walk along the walls of the boat all the way along. But after we leave Rio in South America and start sailing across the southern Atlantic Ocean, as you say, that is a terrible ocean. And we start hitting some really, really bad storms, really very dangerous storms. Also, our compass breaks, so we don't really know where we are. And you can imagine you're a little kid, you're trapped down below, you're at sea for weeks on end. You don't really have very much contact with the adults on board because all they're doing really is steering the boat and kind of sleeping. So it's not a great situation to be in if you're a kid.
Yeah, and again, most of us, I'm sitting to you. If I stood on my desk, you'd get an interesting view of my feet, but on the Zoom thing. But you'd just about be able to see the Mediterranean, and most of us get a bit of the collywobbles if we go out on a trip to Tangier across the Straits of Hercules. But I've got a very good friend of mine does the Mallorca to Antigua run with the yachts, so it's very nice indeed. But he said it's quite interesting for people the first time they lose sight of land and then don't see it for sort of 10 days. It can give them the collywobbles completely. So how do you react to that?
I know. And tried being at sea for 6-8 weeks. Apart from anything else, we didn't have a fridge on board, certainly for the first few years at sea. So your food is very limited. It's mainly kind of canned or dried food, so very limited food. Once or twice we ran short of water because we just had kind of water tanks on board, and sometimes they got kind of punctured. When we were in very bad storms and I was a kid, you weren't allowed up on deck. Because it was too dangerous. Later on, I fought to go up on deck and demanded to go up on deck. But when I was little, I couldn't really do that. So it's really difficult. I mean, you're basically kind of trapped in a cabin for days and weeks on end. Now,
it's all very romantic saying that my child will learn from the University of Life. They will garner things, and it's a thing. Experiences are a very important part of a child's education, but there has to be an education as well. So what happened with this is presumably you couldn't WhatsApp, you couldn't Zoom call with a teacher. So I mean, did they think, oh, we'll just let them I'll just put them in the corner with the complete works of Shakespeare and they'll learn it themselves? How did that work?
Well, there was a little bit of kind of, as you say, they'll learn from the University of Life. What could be a better education, my dad once wrote, than sailing around the world? So there is this kind of concept that somehow you're going to learn a whole bunch of stuff without going to school. And by the way, there is some stuff that you learn. Of course, I know how to change the oil in a car and build a mast and kind of sail a boat. I can tell the difference between different sorts of fish. I can gut a fish, all sorts of things that you learn. But in terms of schooling, that was very limited. My mother was a primary school teacher. She took some worksheets with her. And at least for the first couple of years, she occasionally gave us those, but it was pretty sporadic and not when it was rough and not when we were in port. And then she kind of stopped and said, well, I've done that. And I'm a primary school teacher, not a secondary school teacher. So now you're on your own. And then it was several more years before we got back into a school, and even then only briefly. And I became increasingly frustrated because I'm quite an academic kid, or I was quite an academic kid. I wanted to learn facts. I really wanted to be a scientist. So how do you find out kind of basic facts about the world if, as you say, you're kind of pre-internet, you've got very limited books, you don't really have anybody to ask questions of, and you're kind of on your own?
Another thing, I have this thing with homeschools. Not the problem, and there are advantages in homeschooling, but the thing about schools, it's an education, it's a thing of social interaction. And if it's just you going at 7, which is, if you've gone for 10 years, that's a huge chunk of your life, to put it mildly. And it's the development stage. It's when you learn social skills. Now, again, you can argue, well, we're stopping off in Rio. We are stopping where we're having the experience. We're meeting people from all over different lands. But if you're just pulling into docking in a marina and stuff, are you seeing that much? How do you form friendships with which you would do normally with other children?
Yeah, and that was a huge problem. I mean, there's this kind of concept that you might meet another kid on another boat. But first of all, you didn't meet that many kids on other boats because we were sailing a very odd way around the world. And secondly, if you did meet another kid on another boat, you might be with them for a day or two. And then you'd all sail off in different directions and you'd probably never see them again. So increasingly what happens, and I try to describe this in the book, is the situation on board becomes more and more and more difficult. I'm fighting to get an education. I'm increasingly frustrated that I can't have friends. My relationship, particularly with my mother, gets more and more and more difficult. And I just desperately want to get off this boat. But meanwhile, my parents just want to keep sailing.
Mm. And you become a teenager as well, presumably, which is anybody who, and trust me, I have goddaughters who are becoming teenagers, and that's an interesting ride, and that's on dry land. So I should imagine that having to deal with teenagers on board, going from, the cute little pups that we start off with, and then you become teenagers, and living in a bunk, so you haven't even got your own room, and you've got a drawer, and that must have been an interesting time, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I think that was incredibly difficult. So imagine being on a boat, being a teenager. You've got one bunk, as you say. There was usually only one working bathroom, or head, as you call it on a boat. By the time I became a teenager, my parents had run completely out of money. So we were taking paying crew on the boat. So it was a bit like a floating hotel. We would have 6, 7, 8 crew on the boat, mainly men. So you're a teenage girl on a boat, one working loo, loads of kind of grown kind of men on board. And my parents, I'm afraid, had a very gendered view of what kids should do. So I was expected to kind of cook and clean for several hours every day to try and kind of keep this hotel kind of arrangement going. Meanwhile, as I say, I'm fighting to try and get myself educated. And I'm desperately lonely, frankly, because I don't have any friends. And it's all very well, you can say, well, you can make friends with the crew. But I mean, they're grown adults and I'm a teenage kid.
Yeah, indeed. Were there any sort of mini mutinies then? Did you think, or did you try and get off at some point, somewhere in Europe or somewhere in, I wasn't going to say somewhere in Brazil, but was there any point you thought, right, next plans for sort of like, making land and then not coming back, heading to the hills?
Well, at one point I did run away. I was about 11 or 12, and by that point we were in Australia. And one day, I just packed up all my stuff, which wasn't very much, and walked off. And I walked as far away as I could, right up to the end of the peninsula. I remember I sat there for hours trying to work out what I was going to do. But the problem was I was in Australia. I'm English. I didn't have a passport. I was on my parents' passport. Didn't have any money. Didn't know anybody. Had no contact details for any of my kind of relatives back in England. I had no contact with them after we kind of left. So where was I going to go? Who was I going to reach out to? So eventually I decided I had no choice. So I walked back to the boat. But the one thing I did decide was I was going to kind of take on my parents and really fight to educate myself, even if that meant coming into conflict with them, because what they wanted me to do was to work on the boat. And what I wanted to do was to study. And that was always going to be a conflict in terms of time and space, by the way, because so in order to study, I had to sit somewhere, and that meant taking up a small amount of space.
You see, if you did this now, in this 2020 universe we live in, this would be child abuse, wouldn't it, Suzanne? I mean, I'm not saying your parents are, but they'd say you're denying a child education, you're denying a child friends. They are taken away without their consent. I mean, I'm not saying they are, but it's interesting how the one parent's dream of us sailing around the ocean with our beautiful children, but actually not looking at it from the child. It's almost, and I don't mean to sound horrible. It's almost like your parents have got such massive egos and so selfish. They're doing this and we'll just drag the kids along anyway.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book is there's this whole mythology of romanticizing these extreme childhoods.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's lots of extreme childhoods. I'm going to put my kids in an RV. I'm going to go and live in the middle of a forest and go totally organic or whatever it might be. And I think that's great. If as an adult you want to do that or you want to do that with your partner, that is absolutely fantastic. If you're going to take your kids with you, you've got to bear in mind they don't get to decide. And you're making a pretty radical choice that's going to affect their future because they can't have friends, they can't go to school. This is a big decision. And they really can't articulate their needs because apart from anything else, they're completely tied into being with you. You're their parents. So one of the reasons why I wrote the book was to make that kind of conversation live because we all see these lovely kind of Instagram pictures of, I've taken my kid to some beautiful place and isn't it wonderful? And this, if you like, is the counter narrative. And the kind of the message I want to get out to people, as well as hopefully it being a great read, is think about it, and kind of maybe moderate it so that this is something that's going to be good for your kids and good for you.
So I'm just trying to work out how on earth, in the nicest possible way, you managed to get yourself an interview at Oxford University. How did you manage that if you're on a boat in the middle of, and sort of trying to study and everything else?
Well, eventually my parents basically dumped my brother and me. I was 16, he was 15 in New Zealand, and they sailed off. They just kept sailing.
I'm sorry?
And they did. So they left us in basically a little hut in New Zealand, central of North Island, New Zealand, about a kind of hour away from the nearest town. My brother was put into a school, so he was going to school every day on a bus, and I was left, as I say, my parents had very gendered views of boys and girls, supposed to kind of cook and clean for him and keep running my dad's business, which was booking people onto this boat. And I just decided I had to educate myself. And by that point, I was doing it by post. So I was writing letters to a correspondence school in Australia and trying to get myself kind of educated. And halfway through that year, I wrote letters to every university I'd ever heard of, which actually, funnily enough, means I wrote to most of the elite ones, because, of course, those were the only ones I'd ever heard of, and I couldn't get hold of any addresses. So I wrote these ridiculous letters to Oxford University, Oxford, England, and Harvard University, Harvard, America, Auckland University, Auckland, New Zealand, and so on and so on. Most of them didn't write back. I think they just thought, another kind of crazy person writing to us. Some of them wrote back and said, we won't even consider you, either because you're English, so you don't qualify, or in the case of London University, you're just too crazy. We just can't kind of get our heads around you at all. But the one university that wrote back was Oxford. And Oxford said, write us a couple of essays and we'll think about it.
Okay.
So I did that. I wrote them a couple of essays, and I decided to write a couple of quite crazy essays because I thought if I wrote a normal one, they would compare me to everybody else and I wouldn't have a hope. So one of the essays, for example, was how to do science at sea. How do you try and study science while you're in a storm at sea? And they invited me for an interview, amazingly, on the back of these two essays. I earned enough money to get back to the UK. My dad gave me a little bit. I earned the rest kiwi fruit picking, bought a one-way ticket back to the UK, did the interview, and amazingly, they offered me a place.
Wow. Outstanding. That's absolutely brilliant, Suzanne. Absolutely brilliant. And presumably you accepted it, and that was the end of this particular part of your life.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I accepted that. And the amazing thing is, it was still kind of tricky because I didn't really have a proper student grant or anything like that because I'd been out of the UK for so long. My parents then kind of disowned me and kind of went off sailing again. So I ended up kind of struggling a bit kind of financially. But having got my degree, I then didn't look back because the kind of amazing thing is, and one of the other themes of the book actually is the power of education. It can transform your life. It can take you from one particular situation into a completely different kind of future. And I now have a business career. I've got 3 kids of my own. So my life kind of turned around because I was able to get into university.
And so why the book? Is it to create this counter narrative to the social media shots of here I am with my children and we're in Kathmandu, we're learning from the locals and we're learning ancient ways. Is it to say, look, there are benefits, but there are also some pretty big pitfalls?
Yeah, no, it's definitely about that. Fundamentally, though, it is a kind of cracking good story. It is just an amazing story. And I always knew it was a story that I wanted to tell from the perspective of a child. And I do love writing. This is not my first book. I've been this is the book I've always wanted to write, but I've written some other books first. So this is a book that I really wanted to write as a writer. So that's the fundamental thing. I got to the point where I had to write it when my kids got to the same sort of age as I was when I really struggled on the boat. And I looked at them as a mother and thought, okay, I need to write this story. And I knew if I wrote it, I would be jeopardizing my relationship with my parents, who, of course, had never accepted any sort of criticism of this voyage at all. But I decided it was worth it. It was time to tell my story as kind of honestly as I could and start this debate about what's right and what's wrong, and also kind of just get this story out into the open because it's a great story.
The book is called Wavewalker, Breaking Free. It's by Suzanne Heywood. Suzanne, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Where can people find you and find more about the book and yourself?
Yeah, so I have a website, SuzanneHeywood.com, and I'm also on most of the social media. So you'll find me on Twitter under that name, and on Instagram, and I'm even now on TikTok.
Good grief! Imagine that. The book is called Wavewalker. You can download it as well from our own virtual bookstore. Suzanne, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been great being here.